all of you have this, so I'm not super worried. These are the same ones we used back at the beginning of new teacher training and such. I do understand those. So as an instructor, keeping your camera on really helps me see and engage with you. It gives me feedback, like you laugh at my jokes, whether you're, I mean, last time, honestly, there was one training and the teacher was so exhausted and I thought she was going to fall asleep. And I'm like, are you going to be okay? It's like we're all really just here together and we're trying to do this. It's going to be all right. We're going to make it through. If during the breaks, if you want to, during our work times, shut off your camera so that you can, because I don't have a really pretty thinking face. Like when I think, it's also really closely resembles my mad face. And so then it's just like, and then I'm like sitting there in front of my camera and my hands are all over. Yeah. So if you want to take your camera down when we have our work times, I totally understand that. If you want to leave it on, all we ask is that you just pop it back up when we come back to interact as a group. It really just helps us so we see who we're talking to. Yeah, anyway, I want to, and this is, I was just telling Jim, I just learned to do this, is hide self-view so I don't actually see myself and how much that distracts me. Hello, Angela, welcome. You are good where you're at. We're just kind of moving forward. And Jim, I'm going to give a quick reminder. Can you record the video?
I'm about 2 seconds ahead of you.
Oh my gosh. Okay, so just make sure that you stay logged in. If you're having some internet connectivity issues or whatever, you can email me, but since I will only be checking that communication during work times, so if you don't get right back in right away or if there's some issue, please do not freak out. So this is a really robust agenda of 2 things. So it's do some learning around SLOs and to have some work time around SLOs. So my first question is, who in our learning environment here, how many of you, and you can raise your real hand or you can raise your virtual hand using the reactions if you want, how many of you have actually written an SLO before? Okay, I've got some. Okay, so awesome. We've got some people out there, and this will be really helpful. And I will give you a hint. The first time I wrote an SLO, it wasn't good. It was when this whole process was new, and I was even a trainer for it. And I got done, and I'm like, ooh, I think I could have done that better. So even if you have a previous SLO, you're going to be able to revise it and revamp it. If you don't have a previous SLO and you're working from the ground up, we're going to give you some advice. You are going to make it, I promise. So the resource that we're going to use in this work is our RCAS.instructure.com. It's that Canvas course that we had at the beginning of the year. And this was the course that, I'm telling you people, Jim, best co-pilot ever, just dropped it in the chat for the course. You should already be enrolled in the course, but it's going to have some pieces in there that we're going to use. And it's actually the SLO process guide if you don't have that already too. Some websites. We're going to focus just on the SLO module. Is there anyone that is not able to get into Canvas, or you're not enrolled in the course? Oh, and Jennifer has a name change, Jim. Can you take care of her? See, this is why he's best co-pilot ever. So Jim will get you all caught up, Jennifer, you'll be good. I'm not sure why here we go. So we're just gonna do a little review of what this is. So back in like, I don't know, 2010, 2011, it was required, a federal mandate that we had to have something that showed teacher effectiveness. And so a lot of states moved to a model that required that teacher effectiveness was tied to student data. So a great example, Michael teaches high school science. And so his determination of effectiveness would be determined by the high school science SBAC score, or the South Dakota, it's the South Dakota science score, right, that students take. Okay, I guess that's an okay measuring stick. But what if you're a kindergarten teacher and your students don't take SBAC? Oh, that's okay. We'll tie, it's just the whole effectiveness of the entire school to each of you and your individual effectiveness. Like, that's not a good model. And so the model that South Dakota decided to adopt is this, where each individual teacher presents a plan to show their individual effectiveness of teaching and instructing students. So this is really what you're doing. You are showing and modeling that you know what good instruction looks like. You know how that your students and how to adjust instruction, how to assess them along the way to see their points of need and help them with enrichment and remediation if you need to. And then by the time you get to the summative assessment, ta-da, guess what? They learned something, okay? So that's really kind of walking through this process and what it looks like. So when we look at this teacher effectiveness model, we're looking at, this is your framework for teaching, this is your evaluation, and off to the right over here is student growth. This is your SLO. So your ability to teach students and grow their content knowledge. So these could be anything from district assessments you're using, and we'll talk about we've got a group in here that's anywhere from, I believe, our K through 12. So we have a really broad range of people. So as we talk about these assessments, please just grant some grace. Jim and I are both secondary people, but do not worry. I came with some examples for our elementary too. I was prepared. So kind of talking about this, those SLOs again are the ways that you use data to inform your instruction. So we're going to identify what's really important for our students to learn, and we use content standards and pacing guides, and we have a lot of resources to pull from for that. And then we're going to assess what our students know now. We would do that with either a pre-assessment that is teacher or team created, or you could do that with a district level assessment. And then we're going to create some goals for what our students should be able to learn over that time with us. Then we're going to monitor our students' growth as they work toward that goal. This is really, it's about good teaching. So as we look at this, any of you that have ever worked in a PLC sort of model, this would be a data cycle. All of these, it comes around with so many different initiatives. So as we look at student growth is a student's positive moving toward some achievement or during a point in time. So this is showing our students are able to learn. So our student learning objectives, and those of you that have been in education for a while, you've maybe heard these of, what do I want my students to be able to know and do? Where are my students starting? How will we be measured? And what are we going to be expected to achieve? Those are all things that we may do every single time we have a unit. But the really important piece about an SLO is you're being very deliberate in documenting your thinking and reflection before going in. You're going to be very deliberate about the data that goes into it. I would do like an exit slip, and it was a formative assessment, and I had this pile got it, this pile kind of got it, and this pile doesn't have it. Like, they're going to have to do some work with me tomorrow. This group needs a little bit and they can move on. This group's ready to move on. That's not deliberate data. That's what I call the pile method. Totally appropriate? Yes. Is it what we want to do when we're in our SLO? No. Instead, I would have documented the growth, where each of those students fell, using either a spreadsheet or some sort of data collection during that time. No, it isn't. I don't think it's in there, Ty, but if you want, I would more than gladly share it with you during our first work time. Is that okay? Cool. Thank you for that question. All right, so
And Nicole, just
Yeah.
a point that I dropped in the chat. When we're talking about student growth, it's not necessarily movement across the proficiency levels. We're talking about measuring them from where they started to where they ended up. And all we're looking for is an upward trend that is documented and identifiable through the data.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Jim. So when looking at our SLO, these are things that we're going to want to know or include. Our student population, and this could be the number of students that are going to be included. For some of you, you're going to be required to have, I put some questions to ask your administrator prior to this meeting, so it really helps you. But for secondary teachers, you are going to want to talk with your administrator. Do you need to include all of your students in whatever subject that is? So a great example, Molly, you teach 10th grade English. Okay, so would Molly include all of her 10th grade English students in her SLO data, or could she just use and be deliberate about data collection for one 10th grade English class, still carry out all the steps with her other 10th grade English classes, but not have to be, because the data collection, when you really get into it and you think about, okay, I have my pre-assessment data, I have formative assessment 1, say I teach a standard 3 learning targets, that's 3 formative assessments. If they didn't get it on the first formative assessment, I retaught and then I assess them again. And then I'm going to, like, it's all of these pieces of data and it's like, oh my gosh. And thankfully, I had a coworker who had it was a beautiful spreadsheet and we collected our data within this to show our student growth, but it becomes its own kind of part-time job. And so creating something that's manageable, if you can have that conversation with your administrator of, hey, you know what, this set of students is going to be a really good set for me because of boop, boop, boom. But I'm still going to carry out this process with my other students. I'm just going to report to you out on this one. Okay, as long as you can have a description of why you want that and have that conversation with your administrator, I would highly suggest that. If they do expect you to do all of your students, guess what you're going to take data on? All of your students, right? Right, Molly? I mean, all like 120 of them or 150 of them. So versus Bobby, for example, in her 3rd grade classroom would use her 28 or whatever students that she has. So learning content, this is the specific standards. That's where we pull our content from. You're not going to pull it from just like, say, I'm going to do this chapter. You need to tie this back to the specific standards. Also, what are you going to use to measure the growth? Finally, the interval of instruction. Now, this is important to note. This is going to depend on what your administration wants. So for us, when I did my SLO, and Jim, maybe you can hop in here as to what your expectation too was when you did yours. Ours had to be 1 unit, 1 standard, 1 data cycle. And so that's what ours looked like. I have learned now mine should have been instead 1 unit, but only 1 learning target of the standard because 3 learning targets was too much. And then I got done and my administrator looked at me and goes, did you make this? And I'm like, I don't even know, because I made my goal on 2 of the learning targets, but not the 3rd. So if I didn't make it on all 3 of my learning targets, did I make my goal? No, but it just becomes really very unclear as to, so just make sure whatever you do that you know what achievement at the end is going to look like if you get it or if you don't. The baseline data, this is going to be your pre-assessment. You are not going to write your SLO based on the current unit you are doing. No, I would suggest it's either your next unit or 2 units or so away. It all depends upon when your administration requires this to be done. Something that we have to kind of throw in there is just a reality of what the world we're in right now. Make sure that whatever your SLO is and your assessment of it, that you can administer it if your students aren't necessarily in front of you. We had a teacher in our last one and she's like, oh, I want to do this really great performance assessment. And we're like, yes. And are you going to be able to assess your students? How would you assess them if you were remote at that time? I mean, It's a real question. It's something that we have to, I mean, this is just kind of the situation. So just being aware of that. And then your growth goal and your rationale. So this is your whole reasoning of why you've gone this route and why you're expecting your students to grow in that. So what we are going to do, we want to make sure as we think about our selection for standards that we're taking, that we are collecting that baseline data, which is imperative. So that is something that in order for you to even, I don't want to say begin writing, but really getting into the details of your SLO and the numbers of where your students should grow to, you are going to need that baseline data. If you have your baseline data and you already know what you're going to do, we can really move you forward tonight. If you don't have it tonight, do not worry. There is plenty of work on this document that you are going to crank out regardless. Your principal is a really important role in the fact that they determine kind of what this looks like. Do they want your SLO to be 6 to 8 weeks? Do they want it to be a semester? Do they want it to be the number of students? Knowing, do they expect it in a specific content area if you're K-5? Just kind of, do they need it to align to something within your school improvement plan? I don't even know, but make sure that you are having conversations, if you have not already, with the person evaluating you. It is the same person that evaluates you that you have these SLO conversations with, that to determine what are the expectations so they're very clear. Because there will be some questions like I can't specifically answer due to that. Something also really important is the teams of teachers that you work with have all created an SLO. Like they have a resource for you to at least start with, have a conversation with them with. So we'll use, for example, hold on, who's my Meadowbrook 3rd grade? Angela, right? Okay, I only know this because my son was in 3rd grade at Meadowbrook, but that team of teachers, I know that they are so tight, they probably all sit down and write that together, right? That's probably how they roll. So having that conversation with them of like, hey, what's the SLO you guys are using? There's also something about knowing where a document came from and being able to have conversations about it, because if you just take the document from them and be like, this is great, I'm going to use it and just change the numbers for my kids, it doesn't really give you the backing to have that really good conversation with your administrator about students and learning and the content you teach. So if we go to, oh yes, thank you, Jim. So as we look at the steps of our SLO, we have this, it's called the SLO template blank. And so, or SLO plan blank, and it is there's a link for that in our Canvas course in the SLO section, and maybe Jim will drop yep, I knew it. Or on SharePoint, that's another one with a lot of these documents. So after this Canvas course eventually goes away for you, that will be where you find them, is the TLI SharePoint. So I would suggest that you have that open and just start working on that document tonight. If you are someone who is a paper pencil person, you can take notes on something else, print it. I'm not going to dictate for you what that looks like in your process, but I would highly suggest, we have a load of work time, and I'd highly suggest that you can kind of be able to move forward on that yourself. All right, so as we look at our SLO development, there are these 4 very big steps that we're going to talk through tonight. And as we look at this process, it's important that we know and are able to prioritize learning content. So how do I pick the really important things for my students to know and move forward with? Analyzing of the data of where your students are starting and knowing where you're going to be able to move them to, selecting a really good assessment and how to do that, and then being able to write a growth goal off of that. So for our first one, I want to look at, so can you find this part? It's the prioritizing learning content portion of the SLO. Give me a thumbs up when you find it, just so we can make sure that we're all, oh, God, you guys are so on top of it. Jim, I did not notice a thumbs up from you, but I know you're with me. I'm just giving you a hard time. Okay, so as we look at this, we're just going to talk through some basic pieces of this. So as we remember, your actual evaluation is separate. They used to be linked. So your student growth and your teacher effectiveness used to be linked, and they came up with a number based on the two, and that's gone. So what we do have though is your teacher effectiveness model, which parts of this SLO serve as the possible evidence for that. So when you see these numbers after each of those, as we move through this on the process guide, those are linking it back to the Danielson framework for evaluation and teacher effectiveness. Okay, so just kind of addressing that. So if you need to provide evidence, this would be a good place for your evaluation. So then we have I'm sorry, give me 1 second here. I have to move you guys around. Perfect. So then we have the title of each description on the SLO process guide on the left. The final element that we have is right there. Okay. The actual questions that we're trying to answer and to get to the depth and explain really what they're trying to pull out for that for the description and title. There is also another resource that has some more prompts in it within our Canvas course. If you're really just trying to understand what this is all looking for, that's going to be a good resource, and we can talk about that later too. So when we're prioritizing learning content, a really important piece that we're trying to do is select what we want our students to learn, and this needs to be deliberate. It needs to be thoughtful. It's not just going to be like, let's see, I have 12 standards. I'll just pick one. Let's definitely pick the one before Christmas break. So if you're sitting down with your administrator and they're like, oh, tell me, John, why did you pick this? And then you're like, well, I really wanted to wrap this up before we go to Christmas break, so I just picked this one at random. Not a rich conversation about your knowledge of your content standards. So instead, be really think critically about what standard you want. Why is it essential to move students forward in their learning of the content, not just some willy-nilly random piece? Okay, so we want some things that leverage and have a big grain size for them to move forward in their learning of that content. So we
can I add just a little piece to that, Nicole?
Always.
So when you're thinking about what your essential learning is, think back to your pacing guides or converse with your teams about pacing guides, because there's a good chance that some of that work has already been done for you. If you build off of those essential standards that are already identified, that can help go a long way towards narrowing not only what you need to be assessing, but when is a good time to assess it within your scope and sequence.
And you know what, Jim, I am so sorry and thank you. Will you do me a favor? Will you drop in the pacing guides link from SharePoint? So if they can't remember where to find those, because many of those pacing guides were not just created this year, so just kind of dusting them off. But I think that Jim brings up a really good point. Our pacing guides are a great place to start. They have essential standards already determined. And supporting standards determined. I would suggest using an essential standard, but this is really, it's helping us really pare it down to the specific standard you're going to use and why. Okay. Then we're looking to identify your student population. So our student population is the kids that you see every day and anything that you can tell us about them. So for example, Ty has lots of data on his students and their specific needs. That's going to be some, and you don't have to give names in this specifically, but definitely account for the things that you have. So, I mean, in this year, you may have data that we didn't have other years. Disengaged students for our secondary teachers or anyone in distance learning. We also have any pieces, so IEPs, ELs, Title I, if you want to get as deep as like free and reduced lunch, whatever. I mean, it's your principal, so they know that data usually, but it just gives an idea that you're the teacher and you know your students that you see every day. and anything that may actually impact your ability to meet the goal or that you're being thoughtful of as you're working towards your goal. So this is your work time. This little sweet pooch is going to be the one that kind of drives our work time. So we are going to take right now until, until 4:45. So you have a 10-minute work time to work on specifically these elements that we've gone over. You're identifying your student population and your essential standards that you're going, or standard you are going to use. And as you go through that, if you have questions, feel free to unmute or drop them in the chat. And next, we're going to look at our interval of instruction. So as we look at this, it's really important to think about that priority content we've already determined, and how long is it going to take us from day one of starting to teach that content to the final assessment. Now, things to be aware of. Holidays. If you are someone who is expecting to take maternity leave or paternity leave this year, be aware of that so that you aren't necessarily looking at that time frame when you would be gone. I mean, that would not be optimal, right? So we want to make sure that we give ourselves enough time in this to have our pre-test, our data created, and or our data from that like broken down, and then meet with our principal before we start teaching this unit. That is super essential. You still need to do the SLO at this point, regardless of if we go level 3 for extended amounts of time. So please, 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 I mean, even last year, evaluations were still a requirement. By the time we left for the pandemic, SLOs would have pretty much been expected to be finished by that time anyway, so it wasn't as big of an issue, but you should have your SLO done usually by beginning of March. So your principals need to get evaluations wrapped up mid-March to end of March. So they're going to want this data and everything wrapped up with a nice bow by this point, by that point. So make sure that the time frame that you're selecting from, you're very aware of all of the different things that are outside of the realm of just our curriculum that we deal with. Maybe we'll advance. Here we go. So for this one, you have, did I go too far? Nope. For this one, we're going to give you some work time, and you will have about 10 minutes to think about that interval of instruction, the time frame that you're going to use, how many days are you going to need to teach that? And please know you are not locked in to that last day unless you've picked a day like the day before Christmas break. Yes, you are locked into that. That would be really great if you finished up a unit of learning prior to that, because we know that our students don't come back as sharp as they were after 2 weeks off of school. So we want to make sure that you're being aware of those things, and you can take some time right now to work on that. And please remember, if you have questions, just go ahead and unmute or drop them in the chat. And so now we're going to talk about the analyzing of data and developing a baseline. So this is really tough to do if you don't have your pre-assessment. Okay, so we're going to start there. But what we need to do is we need to have that pre-assessment data or the pre-assessment like already given to our students, so we have those numbers to determine where are they at right now. Now we have some teachers that give like their beginning of the year test, and it covers everything throughout the semester, and they want to use that data, which is completely okay. There are other teachers that have the belief that I want to give it to them as marginally close as I can so that I have really live data, because they might have learned something or built upon that concept through some of the teaching we've done this year. But we want to make sure that within the data that we are taking, we're understanding our student population, kind of like we were talking about with Twyla. So if we're not going to include a student within this data set, we need to know why, and that's really important. And we also need to understand that some of us are in, so I as a secondary teacher, I did a concept that my students came in with zero knowledge of. It is really hard to differentiate how much growth you're going to give them or kind of pick based on when they're coming in. So say I expected them, there was 15 points that they could get, and they got 0s, 1s, and 2s. Okay, I think, so I mean, you are the knower of your content and your students. So what is proficient? Are you going to be able to pull all of them up to proficiency? Are you going to be able to pull part of them? And we'll look at different ways to write these goals. We need to discuss what our assessment is going to be for this pre and post and all of the pieces in between. It's really important that we're picking quality assessment. If you've ever written an assessment by yourself in a vacuum, you know that after you give that assessment to students, you're like, well, dang it, they did not take that as I was hoping for it to go. The benefits in our K-5, we have some really strong curriculums that have a lot of formative assessment pieces between investigations and wonders that you can use. So we want to make sure that what we're doing, it aligns to our content standard and that we're going to get some good data out of it. We also want to make sure that what this is expecting, it allows students some stretch in their knowledge. And what do you do when you have the student that does know it all on your pre-assessment? That's a really great question to have with your administrator. And that's, I mean, specifically talking to our high school teachers, if you have a student that's been through the course before and this is their second time taking it, they have some background knowledge. So kind of like shifting your instruction based on these assessment results is really what we're talking about. If you are working in a team, also asking your team, what is going to be our assessment, and having conversations as a team to have a common assessment is totally appropriate. So within our next piece, this is kind of giving you some time to work on your assessments and what are you going to do. How many of you know that you have either an assessment in mind that you can use already? Okay, and Claire, we can talk about some assessments that you can use because I did pull some ideas from my peeps before they headed out to another training. And that's why our elementary people are out teaching an elementary reading class right now. So, but we can have some conversations about that too, Claire, if you want. And maybe, hey, Jim, I think what I might do is do a breakout room. And is there anyone else in elementary that would want to talk specifically about some possible assessments? Twyla and Bobby? Okay. And Angela? Okay. Miranda, you want to go join us and talk about elementary assessments? Just kidding. Miranda's like, I'm down. Okay. So I'll pull in Bobby. Jim, you're cool staying here. Twyla, Angela. Did I miss anyone that wants to go talk elementary assessments? Oh, Claire. Sorry, bud. Okay, so what I'm going to do is everyone else will stay here, and Jim will definitely be able to answer your questions, but we're going to go talk some elementary goodness. So we'll be back, and our work time is done at 5:15. So we'll come back at 5:15. So think about those assessments that you're going to use on the upcoming and what it's going to look like and what your expectations are going to be.
Okay, so Molly, I started typing, but I think it'll be a little bit easier if I go ahead and just respond verbally here. So, your question, does the pre-assessment need to be formal? Can you get away with an informal assessment? Yes. Will it be easier if you do a formal pre and post? By far. Numbers are your friend in an SLO situation. Um, in addition to that, should the pre and final Do the assessments themselves have to be identical? No. Do they need to assess the same skill? Yes. And Mackenzie, I will get you into the course here momentarily. I'll make sure that you get in. All right, Mackenzie, go ahead and try that link again. You should be good to go now. Watching the time, we do have about 3 more minutes of work time remaining.
At a pre-assessment, it really helped me a lot if I selected something that was quickly scoreable and gave me the data that I needed to direct my instruction for the unit. So could it be, for example, a Google form or Microsoft form that gave instant feedback and be multiple choice? Sure. And there's always the argument of, oh, well, students can guess. Yes, they can. They're not always that good at it though. So what I found is that my students that didn't know still showed up with data that showed they didn't know. And my students that really did know the content, like the one that excelled, it showed in their data too. So, I mean, just a reminder, you need to pick something. I would never suggest making your pre-assessment be like a 5-page writing assignment. It needs to be something that gives you the data that you need to inform your instruction. I could not have used my summative assessment as my pre-assessment because my kids had so little knowledge of the concept. Did I make them though very comparable? Yes. Yeah.
For my ELA peeps, a good option is a quick write or an on-demand writing prompt of some sort around a specific skill. So for instance, if you're working on narrative and setting the scene, which I believe was one of the 7th grade standards, being able to describe the setting. So you give them, it was a dark and stormy night, and they need to write just a paragraph, 4 or 5 more sentences, setting the scene and getting that tone and mood right. That can be your artifact, and you use the same rubric to score your pre and your post. So you got one paragraph instead of a whole story to read.
So we want to just collect the data that we need to inform our instruction and that aligns to our standard. So our growth goal, and this is establishing the expectation for students. Now,
Nicole, Ty had a question.
Oh, yeah, Ty, I'm sorry.
Oh, that's okay. I just wanted to ask if you had any ideas on just build off that writing assessment, how you can do that in an easy way to grade it or score it. You did mention to use something that makes it easier as opposed to going through every single writing and you know, you get the gist of my question.
Yeah. So what I would suggest, in all honesty, if you were using a writing standard, and Jim, you could probably speak to what a writing standard is better. I would suggest using a shorter snippet. So maybe it's a 1 paragraph writing sample, to get a baseline understanding of where your students are at, knowing that you're going to maybe expand to something, and maybe something like being able to pull evidence from textual evidence from, to support their theory or their belief, whatever. That's fine. But maybe it's a much shorter sample, and then their end sample is going to be longer, but your rubric to score it may be somewhat comparable. Jim, how'd I do there?
That checks out. So when you're looking at your rubrics, picking a rubric that is it doesn't even have to be the whole rubric. It can be just one part. So like if we're talking about an introduction to an explanatory essay, that's all you need to get, for instance, I want to say it's writing 10 or it might be writing 4, 7.W.4, I think it is, clear and concise writing. That may be all you need. You don't need to do an entire essay to get a handle on whether or not the kid can write a complete sentence.
I and I appreciate that information. That does help. But I guess I was asking more for what would be an easier method to put it out. Like you had mentioned doing forms, like Google Forms to to ask questions. That might not be as easy to do with a writing assignment. Is there a platform out there that can score those kind of things, or is writing is that just going to be something that I'll have to just buck up and grade myself for every single one? I
It's
guess
kind of the nature of the beast when it comes to writing. There are platforms out there that do score to some degree, but you'll find that it's more consistent if you are scoring it for yourself. That also comes back to your essential learning. Um, you do have some measure of choice in which essential targets or which essential standards you are assessing. So if you're looking at overburdening yourself with a massive amount of writing, if possible, and again, this is a conversation to have with your administrator, but if possible, go with something that's a little bit more straightforward. Perhaps you can use one of the language standards that's specifically grammar related, which would be a little bit more black and white and a little less subjective. But as far as when it comes to writing standards, yeah, that's, I hate to say it, that is part of the nature of the English teacher's burden.
thank you very much. Sorry
Great
for
questions, Ty. So as we look at our growth goal, we want to make sure that what we're expecting our students to be able to do by the end of our lesson is rigorous and realistic. I love the fact that those are like the way to think about it. You want to be like, yes, I want all of my kids to get it. But then also like the realistic, like not all of our kids may necessarily get it because they've come in at such a deficit prior to it. So we want to make sure that we're setting goals that are appropriate for our students, and we'll take a look at some different ways to write those. And what we use is this SMART goal format. So it's specific, measurable, appropriate, realistic, and rigorous, and time bound. And I'm sure many of you have seen SMART goals before. So we're just going to take a little bit of a look at what that means.
Hey, Nicole,
So yeah.
are you meaning to share your screen right now?
Yeah, I'm really just talking to myself. Hey, thanks for letting me know there, Jim.
Hey, you bet.
Where's everyone else been on that one? I'm glad that we could come back to be smart. So what we want to do is we want to make sure that they are specific. So the goal is addressed of what our students need. I always love the example when we're talking about SMART goals. We don't use the goal of like, ooh, I'm going to lose some weight. Like, that's not smart enough. We need it to be really specific. I'm going to lose X amount of pounds instead of I'm just going to lose weight. We need it to be measurable. So I'm going to lose X amount of pounds by Christmas, which that is a horrible time of year to try to like lose weight. Come on, Christmas cookies? Anyway, measurable. So there's like an expectation of how it's going to happen. The measure, like I gave it a specific, and I know when I'm going to have it done by. Appropriate. Our goal is standards-based. Now with weight loss, it's not really standards-based, but I wouldn't pick necessarily of, say I'm going to lose 100 pounds by Christmas, because that would be unrealistic. There's too many cookies. Then something that's realistic for our students, attainable, but also stretches them, right? We want to have that core belief that all students can learn. And it's going to be, if you're going to have a conversation with a principal and say, only 80% of my students are really going to move forward in their learning. As a parent and as a professional, I want to know what's happening with the other 20. What's happening to the other 20% of your kids that aren't going to do any learning during this? So make sure that you're just really aware of that. And then time bound, and be aware of our calendar and things that are coming up. And just because for those of you new to elementary, guess what? Like December gets really crazy. And I know that they're not having holiday programs, but they may still be recording the holiday programs. And then there's always something wonky. So just pay attention to and be realistic with your expectations for yourself. Also, I'm going to add in this, make sure that this is just the realistic of what we have in education right now. Make sure whatever your time-bound goal is that that also allows you some flexibility with virtual learning within that also. Okay. So types of growth goals. Now pay attention because there will be a quiz on this. So we have differentiated growth goals. So this is the type of goal that I always wrote for my students. This is highly encouraged. The differentiated growth goal is saying all of my students are going to learn, but my students that are starting here are going to move up to here. My students that are starting here are going to move to here. And my students that are starting up here, they're not going to get any worse, but they could also go up higher. It just all really depends upon the level that you teach this.
When I was describing all students growing by a certain percentage, that would be an example of the differentiated growth goals.
So then we have the class mastery goal, and this is just saying, so I'm going to use a really great example. All students will be proficient by the end of 3rd grade. That's a goal that would be an example of a mastery goal. So we have an expectation, it's very broad, and then it doesn't really necessarily, the baseline data doesn't necessarily depend on your goal, but it is going to depend on your instruction. And then we have this shared performance, which we talked about in the K-5 group. I would highly suggest, unless you actually, and Katie, like this might be where you would write yours, being a teacher that team teaches. But unless you actually feel accountable to the growth of that student, I would highly, so one of the examples was all of our team wants to say all of our students are going to have this growth. Well, I'm very personable to the students that are in front of me, and I'm accountable to them. I'm not really sure about the learning that's happening on the other side of the wall. So I would suggest, like pandemic phase, when we don't really have kids moving around to different teachers, I would suggest just keeping yours either differentiated or class mastery, unless you have a really, like you're Katie and you're a team teacher, for a reason for a shared performance goal. Okay, so a growth goal example. So when we look at this, or I'm sorry, when we look at this, what kind of a goal do we have here? So we've got 80% of our students will move to strategic or benchmark. And by the way, just for clarification, the Acadian's data is not really great to use. We talked about that in our K-5 group, so they know that. This was just the example the state used within their presentation. And yes, thank you, those of you that pulled that up in the chat. This is a differentiated goal. This is accounting for all of our students moving forward in their learning some way, shape, or form based on how they scored on the pre-assessment. Okay, remember I told you there was going to be a test. It's not like you weren't warned. You can't act surprised. Okay, so here's our next one. What is this one? In classrooms A, B, and C, what type of a growth goal is this? Awesome, shared performance. So this is saying we've got these 3 classrooms. All of our students are going to move forward to 85% by the end of the year. We're all going to own those whatever number of kids there are. Okay. What type of a growth goal is this? Yes, class mastery by process of elimination, and the one we haven't covered yet. So this one, I really want to I want you to take a second though and look at that top example. 90% of Spanish 1 students will pass the Spanish language reading, writing, listening, and speaking end of course assessments. They are saying that 90% of their students will pass all 4 of those. Or are they saying 90% of the students pass this one, 90% of the students pass the writing, 90%? Which one is it? That's a tough one, right? And so this is the one, I wrote mine just like this, but it was a differentiated goal. But I said that, you know, this differentiated goal for all of these different learning targets. And then that was when I got done and I was like, I don't think I achieved it. So make sure that you're very clear in understanding what is it going to look like if I achieve it or if I don't achieve it. So if they just strengthened up this language of this first sentence here of 90% of Spanish 1 students will pass all 4 of the Spanish reading, writing, listening, and speaking end of course assessments. My question then becomes, as a parent and as an educator, what happened to the other 10%? And why didn't they pass? And what were you doing in order to help them make sure that they could pass? Because we can't just be accountable to 90% of the students in our room. Okay, we have to be accountable to all of them. So this is the part that becomes really tricky, and it's kind of like a really difficult math problem. So if I said that 90% of my students were going to achieve the goal, I'm going to say that if I got 65% of the 90%, so a percentage of a percentage, if I have 65% that or less, that's considered low growth for my student growth rating. Okay, so only less than 65% of the students actually attained the goal, whatever it was that I set for them. Expected growth is between 65 and 85%. So we do leave, there is some wiggle room we know that there are things that happen. And even if I wrote my growth goal for, or my goal for 100% of my students, looking at this, you still have wiggle room of getting between 65 and 85% to still have expected growth. Then if you get above 85 to 100%, good on you, of your goal attained, it's considered high growth. This, because of this right here, this is why I always it got me always to be like, it's okay to write my goal for 100% of my students. We know that students are transient and they move in and out, and that we're not dealing with, you know, widgets, we're dealing with people. And so there is some things that are out of our control, and this allows you that. So this is allowing you to create something that stretches you a little bit. So it's rigorous and still attainable. Do we have any questions about the student growth rating before we move on? I just want to make that sometimes gets so confusing, since if you wrote your growth goal as a percentage, it gets to be very weird. All right. Not sure that no news is good news, but we're going to take it. Okay. So providing our rationale, this is making sure that it's providing our reasoning for for the goals we selected. So you should be able to describe how the data, standards, strategies, assessment, student learning, and student needs all come together to create a quality learning experience and a quality SLO for you. So this is kind of just giving you, this is an example. And this specific SLO is using data from last spring. Okay, bad example considering our current situation, but during a normal spring, you would have end of year data to move off of that you could possibly use to move forward with your idea. Okay, so it's not just like, hey, it was a really good idea and I just came up with it off the top of my head. This is really saying that you were thoughtful about the selection and all of the pieces that you did for it. Okay, so for this one, we are going to work this is going to be a really short break so that I can make sure to get you out of here on time. We're going to work until for about 4 minutes actually on the rationale and growth goals, just so that you can, I know, and some of you may be like, I don't have my data, but you could still have an idea of where you want to move and what you want that to look like, and just get something down on paper, or even just kind of jot some notes of where you want to move. And we'll come back at 5:41. Are you in the dark, Jim? Word also is a grade or whatever, but it's really important that the recording of that data become deliberate. So if I'm doing 30 students, that's one thing, but if I'm doing 120 students, that's a whole different thing, and it becomes very time consuming. So just be aware of that. Okay, so we've got our learning strategies are next. So as we're looking at the learning strategies section, this is where it's really showing your ability to name it. Can you name the high impact strategies that you're going to use with your students during your instruction? And you may go straight through your unit plan and pull them out. And it may be things simple as like turn and talk if you want to get that way. But if you look at this one, this is just giving large and small group instruction. Okay, that's a really easy strategy that we all know. Interventions based on benchmark assessment. I would also say enrichment based on benchmark assessment. Reteaching when necessary. Reciprocal teaching. Use of math manipulatives. Okay, could you probably add to this list and expand upon it? The more that you can put in here, it is going to give you a much, if you look at how many of the domain 1 and from domain 4, it's showing that you know the art of teaching, and you can say and name the specific strategies. This is a great piece of evidence for evaluation and to drive some instruction or some collaboration with you and your administrator around. Okay, we are going to, we're going to skip our last work time because for the sake of getting you out of here on time, and we just have like this piece left. So what we've done is you've written your whole SLO in this like imaginative process that we're moving through. And as we think about it, so this next part is going to SLO approval. So this is where you haven't started doing any instruction yet still. You're sitting down with your administrator, or it could be totally virtual if you wanted to do it that way. But having a conversation about all of those pieces that you just put together. You need to have your SLO approved before you start teaching this, because your administrator may have expectations that are not addressed within your SLO. So that this is where you've got to make sure that you give yourself some cushion before that first day of instruction and that pre-assessment, so that you can write the SLO and get it approved in that time. Okay, so you're going to submit it to your principal, however that may be. It may be just putting it into a shared folder. The principal then approves it. They may have conversation with you around it. They may just check it off. I mean, mine always wanted to have a conversation. I don't know what that process is going to look like for you specifically, but there is a portion of it where SLO approval, where both of you need to agree upon it prior to you starting the instruction. So then our next step within this is the ongoing communication. You have your span of time, and you are continually formatively assessing your students along that. And you're going to have that like, hey, how's it going, from your administrator? Ugh, not good. I wrote my goal for 5 students because I work with small group instruction and intervention. And guess what? 3 of them like tested out of my program. And I now only have 2 for my original baseline data. Real conversation to have, right? Totally appropriate. There is a modification possibility within the SLOs. Okay, so for extreme circumstances like the example I just gave you, it's extremely rare that you're actually going to modify your SLO. Are you going to maybe modify your instruction? Yes. Are you going to maybe go back and modify your goals? Probably not usually. These are just some examples of reasons. Unexpected medical leave is an example that, like, sorry, I'm not going to be able to use this as my SLO because I had to go on medical leave for something unexpected. And instead, you would have to change how you're going to do that and maybe rewrite the whole thing. So this is our final piece, and you're preparing for your summative. Now, at the summative, you have given your assessments, you have all of your data, your spreadsheet looks really great and polished and finished. You have your finished SLO, you've done the reflected pieces on it. And then, Bobby, I will answer that. Yeah, if you have students that are returning from distance learning, I guess, did you include them in your original goal would be the question. If you didn't include them in your original goal, I think I would just move forward. If you did include them in your original goal, or they went back and forth, or they moved out, you're only going to write your summative piece. Your final growth is going to come off of only those students that I took pre-assessment data. So did I have students that came in the middle of the unit? Yes. Did I move along and assess them just like my other kids? Yes. Did I include them in if I attained my goal or not? No. Make sense? So I'm still gathering all their data. I'm just not necessarily, they're not counting towards my goal. The same is true for students that left. They're not they're not counting towards my goal either, basically because I don't have summative data on them.
To add to this, for those of you that might have a master's or have done some work with action research, all this is a variation of data collection and analysis. So we're not looking to reinvent the wheel. We just need to have some sort of data to back up our opinion. Yeah, the kids are able to do this.
So we all know that the real learning is very important. and the struggle within that learning. So these links were not provided to you before our learning, but here are some pieces. If you haven't checked these out, these are both on the Canvas website or the Canvas page for, so one is the SDEA website. This has a repository of some SLO examples. This little gold mine of the DOE website of examples doesn't just have examples, it also has some sample assessments to use if you wanted to see something. Please know, as far as, I'm not sure what the vetting process is for these. So just always be aware of that. I mean, that's just like a common disclaimer anytime you pull anything off the internet. Go ahead, take a look at it and really just make sure that it's going to measure what you want it to. But those are two really good websites to use. I know that if you're really like, oh, I don't even know what this looks like, I don't have someone in my teaching team that I can go ask because I'm a singleton. Go ahead and go in there, take a look and see what a finished product looks like. I think that that's going to be really helpful as far as getting to see just the final product and knowing that your expectations may be different based on your administration. And all right, so send. So also what I just sent to all of you is the additional pay form, the instructions of how to fill out the digital form. And then on top of that, also there is a third document in there, and it's all of the building codes, because let's be honest, who really knows their building code? Because if you put your account on there, you're definitely going to make friends. Our final, I mean, this is kind of, we're just wrapping it up at this point, is we know that this was down dirty and really quick. To sit and write an SLO, and I am sorry, I have to move the page on because that guide not only represents how I feel most days, but also really distracts me. But it's really important that you take some time to sit down with this. When this process of SLO writing was first brought out in our state, teachers were given a day and a half to sit and do this work and dig into it and write their pre-assessments and determine what their formative assessments would be. And like, that's a huge chunk of time. So please don't think that this is going to be something that you're going to have completed in this 2-hour training. No, there's a lot of other pieces of information that you're going to need to collect, one of which being talking to your administrator, knowing the assessments you're going to use and the standards you're going to measure, and then going from there. As we end off, are there any just really like, oh my gosh, I don't get this, what can I do, questions that we can help with before you head out for your evening? You and I both know that when you end a class and your students have no questions, they either A, are so enriched with the information you just gave them, or B, are just at the point where they're like, I don't even know what to ask. So please know, we all know that you're really enriched with the information Jim and I just gave you, but also you're going to come through some stumbling blocks, and Jim, myself, Tara, Katie, Andrea, anyone in our department, in our TLI team, your administrators, your teaching team, they are all great resources for you to leverage with questions. I would happily look over your SLO and ask you some questions about it to gain a better understanding. If you needed feedback, you're like, I'm just not, like, maybe you don't want to quite throw this out to your teammates yet, and instead you want to throw it out to Jim or myself to get some ideas. Happily. We actually, I'm going to say this, Jim, we kind of dig that stuff. Like, that's the stuff that just like is really cool to us. Anyway, so please feel free to let us know any questions. I sent you, if you did not receive the additional pay form, let me know. That form will go back to myself or Suzanne Pearson, and she does not send them in until she gets a lot of them. So for those of you that are maybe not as quick to fill that form out, we're waiting for you. Those of you that filled the form out and you've already replied and sent it in my inbox. Just kidding, no one's done that. Pressure's off, don't worry. Hey, you guys have a great evening. We are nerds. That is totally true. Jim and I will sometimes sit on Zooms and just type on the computer together and nerd out. Yeah, by the way, Jim, I turned the lights on for you.
I saw that.
I hope you noticed.
I don't know. I was kind of digging the whole moon view thing. Oh, puppy.
If you want to stay on, Jennifer, I can show you the picture of my soon-to-be puppy, like my puppy on order. Okay, because things that make my day go round is puppies, because who doesn't love that? The rest of you, you guys are all the way finished. Jim, you can stop recording. I think we are way past anything.